Okay, everybody, this is a kind of going back to chapter 9. This is what we didn't get to do right before we left when school got closed. So I'm just going to do some notes up here doing this. If you have your chapter 9 note packet, this is from section 9.6. And if you have your packet, you can go and get that and use that while we're doing this. If you don't have the packet, you can't find it, it's not with you, whatever, you could just do this on a piece of paper. It's just something we have to really make sure that you know. And I just wanted to get into chapter 10 because all the other teachers had decided to do that when we got going, okay? So this is the quadratic formula. And if you want to hit pause and go find your packet, you can, but you could just use a piece of paper. So if you want to hit pause and go find something to do this with, go ahead. Okay, the quadratic formula is something to be able to factor when I can't X factor something, okay? So, and I could use it in place of factoring too. And remember, we did completing the square. Not everybody was a fan of that one. You can use this in place of completing the square. But completing the square is a skill that you have to have. This one's a little bit maybe more user-friendly because you're just plugging a bunch of numbers in and being able to do the math, okay? I can use the quadratic formula when I have my equation in standard form. So if you remember standard form, it just has to be in that order and it has to equal 0, okay? The quadratic formula is this beast right here. So that's the quadratic formula. You have A and B and C, and you're going to get that from the standard form of an equation. So you're going to go grab these values and plug it into the quadratic formula. So it's just putting some numbers in certain places and then doing your math. It's really not that difficult. I know it looks yikes, but this is not that hard. The one thing I want you to remember before we kind of move on, it's just some math rules we got to remember. That's a negative sign right there. And if I put in a negative B in for B, it's going to change that sign to positive, okay? And kind of the same thing here. If I plug in something for A or C that's negative, well, eventually I'm going to have to be using that negative sign with it. It's going to make it positive, all right? The other thing, too, I'll warn you about is if B is negative and you plug it in here, that's always going to end up being positive because I'm squaring a negative number. So there's just places here where we make little tiny mistakes because we forget about our signs and we just got to be good about it, okay? This piece of the quadratic formula that's underneath the radical is called the discriminant. And it sounds like it discriminates depending on what the sign is that we get from doing all the math inside, okay? So if you want to write this down, if the discriminant ends up being, I get like an answer of 0. I plug in B squared and AC and do all the math, I get an answer of 0. I'm going to have one solution. Because remember, we're trying to factor it. We couldn't, so we have to use this for trying to find solutions. If I get a 0 under here, I'm going to get one solution, okay? If I get a positive answer, whatever it might be, if I get a positive answer, I'm always going to get 2 solutions. Okay. if I get a negative answer inside the radical, like a -1, if you guys remember, I can't take the square root of negative answers, okay? So I will get no solutions if I get a negative answer. But that's after I do all the math and stuff like that. So the discriminant tells me how many answers I'm going to get. So in some other math classes, you work with the quadratic formula, but I might just work with the radical to determine how many answers I get. It won't tell me what they are, but it'll tell me how many I get, okay? So there's the quadratic formula, and I usually tell my kids this story, but I don't know if I want to really do it here on the video, but I'll give you the condensed version. When I was in high school having to do this, we spent like 2 weeks doing just the quadratic formula. And my Algebra 1 teacher, Mr. Wimberly, we were doing on chalkboards and stuff like that, no calculators. And he, taught it, and I didn't get, I understood what I was doing, but I always forgot to do this piece down here at the bottom, the 2 times the A. And so for like the first 3 days, I was screwing up, and he kind of say, well, this is where you're messing up. But then he got kind of mad at me, and he was getting tired of me making the same mistake over and over. And somehow my dad and him had become good friends. And so he calls my dad at home and says, Mr. Kaznick, your son's really screwing up the quadratic formula. He needs to fix it. And I think you guys know my dad was pretty good at math, and we always did our homework together. So I get home, and he kind of jumps my case, and so we worked hard on it. I go back to school for the next week and a half, and Mr. Wimberly's on my case every day. He'd be doing these problems up at the board, and he'd do the top part, and then he'd say, Kaznick, what do I do now? I go, Mr. Wimberly, you do 2 times A. Well, what's A, Mr. Kaznick? And then, so I'd tell him whatever it was. Thank you, Kaznick. And he did that every problem, every day for like the next week and a half. And I went to an all-boy high school, so they were kind of ruthless to me. They called me silly names like Quad and stuff like that. So I'm scarred for life by the quadratic formula, so I'm hoping that you won't be, okay? All right, so let's try this a little bit and see how we do. If you'll take this equation right here, 4x squared minus 6x plus 7 equals 0, we're just going to do the quadratic formula. You might want to kind of always write it off to the side so that you have it all over 2A, Mr. Wimberly. So that's what he would do to me each day, each problem, okay? So my A is here, my B is that, it's a -6, be careful with that, and there's my C. There will be no variables in this problem once I substitute it in, okay? So X equals minus B, which is a -6, plus or minus square root B squared. Well, B was a -6, but squared. So it will end up being positive 4 times my A, which was 4, times my C, which is 7, all over 2 times your A, which was 4. Okay, so there you go. Plug everything in. There's no x's in there. X is left out. I'm just taking coefficients and constants, and I'm plugging that in and do your math. Okay, so let's do this. That minus -6 is going to end up being positive. -6 squared is 36 minus, always write the minus sign and multiply this stuff out. Okay, so 4 times 4 is 16, and 16 times 7 gives me 112. All over 8. Okay, that's what he used to do to me. All over, Kaznick, what do I do now? 2 times 4 is 8, Mr. Wimberly. Thanks, Kaznick. So there you go. Okay, now I got to do a little bit of math inside the radical. And 36 minus 12, I believe, gives me 76, but would be negative. Okay, so we get that. Now I want to make sure we understand this. This piece right here was called the discriminant. And back up there, I said, you know, if the discriminant is 0, I get 1 answer. If it's positive, I get 2 answers. But if that number inside is negative, I'm going to get no solution, okay? Because I can't take the square root of a negative number. When you get into Algebra 2 and some calculus classes, there's stuff that I will do to make that positive, and I can do it, but we're not going to teach that to you right now. So right now, I do not get a solution for that, okay? All right, so let's try some problems. Hopefully they will work. I hate doing all that work and then I don't get a solution, okay? So we're going to take this equation right here. I'm going to show you kind of how to work this one too at the end. So x equals negative your b. Let me go back. There's your a, there's your b, there's your c. Your b is a negative 2 plus or minus square root b squared. So b was negative 2 squared. That will be positive. Minus 4 times my a, which in this case was a 1, times my c, which is a negative 8. All over 2 times your a. Your a was that 1 again. Okay, so you get lots of repetition here except for c. Okay, so plug everything in. Be careful. Make sure you take the signs with it. And now let's be careful doing our signs. So that's going to make this a positive 2 plus or minus square root. Negative 2 squared gives me a positive 4. Write the minus sign down and multiply these numbers. It's just 4 times 1 times negative 8, which gets me negative 32. It's really important that you kind of do it that way. It's kind of the way I've always taught it, and we seem to not make as many mistakes if I kind of ignore that minus sign right here for a second and multiply those 3 numbers out. Okay, so x equals 2 plus or minus the square root 4 plus 32 now. That changes into plus now, okay? So being careful with our signs all over 2. Okay? I think you'll notice that these kinds of problems take up a lot of room. Write small, be efficient. And I'm writing out every step. There's stuff here you could probably do in your head a little bit. Square root of 36 all over 2. So 2 plus or minus, okay, square root of 36, that is perfect. It gets me 6 over 2. X equals, now you got to write this little plus or minus sign tells me I get 2 answers. So write it out twice. 2 plus 6 over 2. And x equals 2 minus 6 over 2. So you got this was positive back up here. That tells me, if I remember our little rule, if it's positive in there, I get 2 answers. Well, here's where the 2 answers come from. So 2 plus 6 is 8 over 2, which gets me 4. 2 minus 6 gets me a negative 4 over 2, which is negative 2. Okay? What's that mean? Well, remember, we were solving for x, and if we go back to the beginning of chapter 9, we were graphing parabolas. And basically what it means is these values for x is equal to negative 2 right here, and x is equal to positive 4 right here. And that's kind of where my parabola would go through the x-axis, okay? So that's what these answers get you, okay? All right, now I'm going to be brutally honest with you. You're not always going to get answers going to be like this. It's pretty much always going to be in decimal form. And when I get answers like this, please don't be mad at me, but we could have factored this problem at the very beginning and done it that way. But we want to use this problem to kind of illustrate how to get 2 answers and make it a little bit easier, okay? So there you go. All right. The next question we'll try is this one. Okay, and the issue with this problem is that one, it does not equal 0. So you got to always check it. Does it equal 0? It doesn't. Okay, so I'm going to subtract 1 from both sides, and I get this. Okay, good thing for me probably to do is to go ahead and write your A and your B and your C, just so you know. And then have the quadratic formula out in front of you, so you remember how and where to plug stuff in. So minus B, and your B is a -3 plus or minus B squared. So B was a -3 squared. That will always be positive. If I put a positive number in there, it's going to be positive. If I put a negative in there and I square it, it ends up being positive. Okay, so don't make a mistake there. 4 times my A is 2. My C is now a -1. All over, Kosnick. 2 times my A, which is 2. See how I'm scarred for life? I keep bringing that stuff up. X equals, these become positive 3 plus or minus square root. -3 squared is 9. Minus, put that minus sign, I'll multiply these up. 4 times 2 is 8, times -1 is -8. All over 4. Okay? You got to get in a rhythm with these problems, okay? So just kind of stick with it. Okay, that's going to become, up here it becomes positive, so that's going to give me a 17 over 4. Okay? So let's go and look at how we get answers with this, because 17 is not perfect. It is positive, so it means I'm getting answers, but it's not perfect. So x equals 3 plus square root of 17 over 4. And x equals 3 minus square root of 17 over 4. Okay, so this is going to get me 3 plus, in the square root of 17, put that in your calculator, comes out to be about 4.1 over 4. So 3 plus 4.1 gets me a 7.1 over 4. And then let's go down here and do this one, and then we'll do some answers together. So I'm going to get 3 minus 4.1 over 4. Okay, and that's going to get me a negative 1.1 over 4. Okay, so 7.1 divided by 4 gives me about 1.8. I rounded it to the nearest tenth, okay? And then negative 1.1 divided by 4 gives me about negative 0.3. I rounded that to the nearest tenth, okay? So we're going to need you guys to use your calculators. Depending on your calculator, it just depends on how you input it. You're going to have to play with that. The calculators we had at school, you'd have to hit second function, the square root symbol, and then put in the number. So we put in 17 and get a decimal, round it to the nearest tenth for what we're doing, and you're good to go. Okay, so sometimes we're going to ask you to get answers like that. Sometimes, though, we might just ask you to make sure that the radical is simplified. In this case, 17 is simplified. You can leave your answer like that. So we'll just have to make sure you understand which way to do it. You know, this can get a little tedious, a little scary, but you can do this. It's not that hard. Okay, so I'm going to put a couple more problems up and have you guys do them. So write them down, hit pause, do your math, and then I'll have the solutions up. Okay, so give these a shot. And make sure you're giving yourself plenty of room. This second one, I'm going to get it to equal 0 for you. It didn't equal 0, but I'm going to move the 8 over. So I subtracted it to get over, okay? So then make sure you go back and identify your A, your B, and your C for each one. and then go ahead and do each one and see what you get. Okay? So hit pause, and then I'll put the answers up, and then you come back and see how you did. Okay? Okay, so here are your solutions, and taking up a ton of room. Okay, so plugging in everything, being really careful with my signs. For the first equation, I get that my answer down here, I get my two answers, +7 and -3. Okay. For the second one, once again, just kind of doing all my work and being really careful with my signs. I get down here, I get the square root of 228, and I plug that into my calculator. I rounded it to 15.1. So then I'm going to get two answers, okay? So plus or minus. First answer I get is 0.9, and that's rounded. My second answer, I get -1.2, and that's also rounded. Okay, so usually to the nearest tenth, and then be able to do your work on that one. Okay, so those are some basic, Pythagorean or quadratic formulas. Being able to do, really do the math and being careful with your signs. That's the biggest thing. There's a lot going on. You just got to be really focused on that. Okay. Remember, looking at the discriminant, if you get a 0 inside there, which we didn't get today, it would be one answer. If you get a negative value inside there, there's no solutions. That's the very first one that we did today. There was no solution. But then these other 4 that you've done, my discriminant ended up being positive. So now I know I got to keep on going and get the math for that. Okay. So make sure that you have the quadratic formula in front of you somewhere written down, and then do the assignment with this, and just be careful with your signs. Do a good job, and it looks like a lot, and it is, but it's just pretty simple math. Just being extra careful. Okay.